application they're tied to.
Yeah.
But the one that I'm using is 7,000. I think the minute you cross over the 1,000 numbers, it's pretty much free.
Pretty open.
Do whatever you want with it.
I do 8888 all the time. I don't know why. It's just what I do.
And actually, you'll notice that a few of these demos will have different ports as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Way to screw everyone up. I'm going to give you a different port now.
All right. So before in the command prompt, I was in the hello world directory. I typed in cd .. to get out of that directory and back to the parent directory. And then from there, I'm going to go into my 02 hello world folder. What you'll notice if I run directory, I've got the same setup, node, and then there's this file called app.js. I'm going to run it. Here we are. Something's running because our command prompt at the top is showing the currently running command, so it's still running. And I'm just going to pop over to the browser, type in http localhost 7000. It's going to run.
Yeah.
There we go. Hello world.
All right. So we've
Through the browser.
So we've got the whole kind of, now we can start building web pages.
That's right. And even if you just want to create a simple API, we'll show you how to do that with Express a little later. This is all you need, really. It's a few lines of code and you've got an HTTP server. I'll show you one last thing just to prove to you that this was sent with the right content type. I went into my F12 tools here, went into the network tab, press play to start capturing network traffic. If I refresh, there you'll see it. That's my type. I'm going to control 1 so you can see it a little more clearer. Text/plain.
Perfect. That was fairly quick to get up and running with that kind of thing.
Yeah, not a lot of lines of code to get an HTTP server running.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, hello world, basic, server going. We're going to talk about a couple more, I would say, fundamental, but also maybe a little bit more complex concepts with Node that are just important to note as we start getting into some of the more advanced things that we're going to start to do, right? So we have like event-driven programming.
So what is event-driven programming?
I don't know. What is it?
What is it?
Tell me.
Awesome. Basically, it's a different way of thinking about your program flow. Normally, in sort of the more imperative style programming languages, things tend to follow, the lines of code tend to follow each other, and it's a little bit more linear in terms of flow.
Right.
With event-driven programming, it's a little bit different. So basically, the flow of your program is defined by the events that are taking place. So if you're building a network application, if you're building a GUI application, typically there's an event, like say a control click, a mouse press, network I/O, something that came in, a request that came in. Those are all, drawing. Those are all events. And the way that you structure your programming in event-driven programming is by handling specific events as they arrive. So the flow is no longer linear; it's more split up.
Sure.
And you just wait for an event to actually take place for a specific code callback function to execute.
So I could be resizing the browser, and I could have made a call to a service that was going to give me all my Twitter API, feedback, and that might come while I'm also doing this. So it's also handling what I'm doing here, but also another event that might have happened at the same time, for example, right?
And there's a loop that takes control of which event takes, which callback is called next.
Right.
Now, if you'll notice in our HTTP server, if I go back to that, this is an example of event-driven programming. You've got this function, create server, and I'm giving it a callback, right? And you'll notice request response. The minute that we get an HTTP request, that's when this function is going to get executed. That's the event-driven programming part of this server.
Right, because it's not necessarily a synchronous option. It's not like something just happens automatically. It's like there's a process that happens, and you've got to wait for that.
Exactly.
Right? So another kind of concept that, to cover that I think is fairly important is the node event loop.
That's right. So we're talking about all of these different events that are taking place. Well, how do we know what event's going to get executed? How do we trust that this callback will actually get executed, right? Because it seems like there's nothing to guarantee that in our code. Well, the way that happens is that Node provides you with an event loop as part of the language. So the minute that you call Node, you don't need to call a start function to start this loop that's waiting for events. You literally just put in your script, your code, and the loop starts the minute that you start Node. And it doesn't end until the last callback is called. So what that means is that if you started and created an HTTP server, okay, the end of that callback will just never arrive because you're always going to be waiting for HTTP requests to come in. And as a result, your program won't shut down until you tell it to shut down. Now, one thing to note about this event loop, if you're coming from other languages, the event loop is run under a single thread. So if you ever call a function like sleep, for example, which normally pauses the process, you're going to pause everything else as well. The event loop will simply just stop executing any other event. So anything else that comes in, it'll just have to be put on the back burner.
I think a lot of people are kind of familiar with that just in terms of JavaScript in general, how that works and how they capture things constantly and things like that. So we've got another big one that's important, and I think you already kind of mentioned this previously a little bit, was the whole idea of blocking, right? What happens with that?
That's right. So if you call sleep, for example, you're blocking the event loop, right?
Right.
Now, of course, there are other operations that you could do that might also block the event loop as well. Things like reading a file.
Right.
Now, what you'll see on the screen is this blocking I/O, and I'm basically getting the file system module, and I'm trying to read a file. But I'm reading it synchronously. So what's going to happen is the event loop's going to be blocked until the whole file is read. Now, this might not be very optimal, because if you think about it, sometimes files are going to be 100 megabytes.
Really, really big.
Like really big. So
like, why?
If you're running this HTTP server and you're getting all of these requests, and all of a sudden you need to read a file, and that file is really big, you're going to stop all the other requests from being handled.
Yep.
And it's just not going to, it's basically going to freeze your server.
Yep.
So
it basically locks out your user.
It locks out your user. So
it's just it's non-responsive until it's done.
There's a common thing that users experience called when the application freezes, and that's pretty much what it means. Like there's some long-running operation in the background that's stopping the ability to click on things. You know?
I'm always like, I feel like when that happens, if I just like mash the keyboard as fast as I can, it's gonna just make it go quicker. It's going to make it work again.
But the thing is, you're probably making it worse because you're creating all of these events that now it has to process.
Oh, I totally am.
It's just like...
Yeah. The problem's the user. I know that. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of those things to consider is like when you're doing those processes, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, is that you have to be really, really, concerned about that and what you're doing to the experience in general.
Especially if you're using Node, there's an event loop that's built in. So you don't want to run anything that's synchronous. You want to have all your operations be as async as possible. And even things like reading from a file, you can run asynchronously.
Yeah.
Just to show you an example, if we just pop back to the Visual Studio screen, you'll see here's my example of reading a file synchronously. When this code executes, the entire file content will be in this variable. I'm going to output it afterwards. Now, if I want to read that same file in a way that's asynchronous, all you notice is the function call is going to be different. The function name is different. I'm still going to pass it the file that I want to read, but here I'm passing a callback. And what that's going to do is, it's the minute it reads a chunk of that file, it's going to execute that callback and then move on and let other events run.
Right.
And it won't just freeze until the whole file is written. It'll read it in little buckets, little buffers. And that's one way that you can avoid freezing your event loop. Yeah,
like back in the day where you used to go and read a file and you'd read line by line. Right, because at least you could read the line, use that line if you need to display something, read the line again, that kind of thing. So that's basically kind of what it's doing, just chunks of information.
Chunks of information. And in event-driven programming, your objective is really to get the program flow tied as closely as possible to the actual data flow. So if you're getting small chunks of data, ideally your callback should be dealing with that specific chunk of data as they arrive.
And you've mentioned callbacks a lot. Callback, 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 callback. Basically a function that handles or something that you want to be, called when something's returned, right? So we got the whole idea of callback style programming.
Exactly. So you've got the event loop, and the minute any event occurs, ideally you want to execute something to handle what that event means. So that's what callback style programming is. Now, you can imagine when you're running a server application or just any application in general, there's going to be different types of events, maybe hundreds of events, depending on the application. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of different callbacks. Now, this could actually end up with something that I'd like to term callback insanity. And let's just show you an example.
Yeah, if your eyes hurt when you look at this, our eyes hurt as well. We feel your pain.
Yeah. So in this example, what we've got is we've got the file system again. We're trying to read a directory. And then for each file, we're going to check to see if there was an error that happened. If there is an error, continue.
Yeah.
For each file, we're going to read something. And then it just keeps going on and on and on till at the end, we're trying to actually accomplish something, which is just resize all of the images in this directory and then save them somewhere else. But this is what it might look like.
Yeah, just nested all the way down. It's like a big arrow. It ends up being like, keep going, oh, more, all the way back. And, in some ways, like you look at that and you're like, okay, at least I know that this is happening, and this is happening, and then this is happening, but it's not readable. It's definitely not manageable. And it's really, really hard to debug because you're just following this crazy kind of, I like to call it the arrow, but it's just like, oh, here I go. I'm going to insanity and then all the way back, right?
Yeah, it's not manageable at all. But there are ways to handle callback insanity. And one of those ways is using promises style programming.
Yep.
All right. And basically what it is a promise is basically a function that will return a promise.
You will return a promise?
Sorry, that was very circular. let me try again.
I'll be right back. I got coding to do. I need some promises.
Exactly. Promise style programming, it's basically when a function will return a promise object that will return something in the future.
Right.
So it's promising that it will do something for you.
Yeah, I still need this. I need a lot of this. And it's the idea of like, returning something to you, and you can figure out when it's done, you can figure out if there's an error, you can figure out if there's success, and you handle it, when you need to handle it and what it should do, and you handle those callbacks. So promises are actually, I think one of the first times I saw promises was like in the jQuery framework, and I was like, oh, what's this? And you start to realize, oh yeah, it's used throughout, and so it's a very common kind of concept that I think a lot of people have kind of taken to.
Yeah.
You can chain promises together too. So if it returns something, you can have something else return another promise and chain them. That whole kind of beauty of JavaScript thing that's going on. But promises can kind of help you simplify a little bit of that, right?
That's right.
So we're going to go into another demo, and I think just based on that idea, and it's going to be a basic TCP demo, right?
Yeah, so what I'm going to show you is, if you open up Project 5, it's this classic server. Looks fairly similar to the HTTP server that we created, but in this case, what I'm doing is I'm using TCP instead, so I'm requiring net as opposed to HTTP, but I'm still going to return the same thing, hello world, run server.listen, looks very, very familiar. Now, if I run that in this little file right here, I'm going to stop the previous app. I'm going to get out, go into 05, and run node server.js. It's going to be running. Now, if I want to run the client, I want to get information from this server through TCP, it's going to be a little bit different. And this is going to introduce this concept called event emitters. It's a node concept. And what you'll notice is that things here are a little bit different. For one, you're creating a new socket as opposed to a server. You're telling it to connect to a specific port and host. And what's interesting here is that there's this new function that you probably haven't seen before called on. And what this function is going to do is it's going to say, hey, whenever I get a data event, execute this function. So on data, run this callback. Okay, and all this callback is going to do is just going to log whatever it was received and then close the client. So if I go back into my command prompt, so here's my server. I'm going to open up my client. I'm just going to move this on the side a little bit so you can see both of them side by side. If I go into 05, and you might not be able to see it on the screen, but here it is. I'm going to run node client. And there we have it. So the server reported a connection from localhost, and the client received data. Now, you'll see this is very different from what we've done with the callback, and this is event emitters.
Cool. And I think like for some of those more complex things like event emitters, that kind of thing, we have a lot of stuff that's listed in our slides, and some extra resources in terms of, where to go with those kind of things. Important concept to know.
That's right.
I think, quickly what we should try to go through is the Node Package Manager. And there's been a couple of really great questions in the chat, which I'll also try to, filter through maybe in the next module. Some really, really simple and awesome questions that are being asked. Some simple, some definitely not, trust me. So some of them like, whoa, yeah, you're doing something serious there. So Node Package Manager. Let's quickly talk about NPM and Node Package Manager is, a lot of languages have their own kind of versions of this if you want to think of it that way, whatever it may be. So NPM, official Node Package Manager for Node, right?
Yeah, it's bundle install automatically with your environment. Very simple to use. NPM install the package name. If you add --save, it will actually install it to package.json, which is a file in your folder that will describe the dependencies that are available to you that are needed for this module. So here's an example of package.json, Node 101, MVA presentation code. You can see that you can describe the module that you're in and say who the author is, say what's the main file. And what's really cool about package.json is that you can also list the dependencies that this module needs.
Yep.
And then whenever you run npm install, without any package name, it will just take a look at this package.json and install everything.
Yeah, it's just like the requirements for your project. And the beauty of it is like you can say, I need this version of this library.
That's right.
Often you need to do those kind of things.
Yeah, and there's lots of great modules that are on NPM. And here's a list of some of the most depended ones.
Underscore, my number one favorite. I love underscore.
If you're a front-end dev and you love underscore, you can also use underscore on the back end as well. So you can see that you've got that code portability between the front end and back end with JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, whether it be async, request, popular NPM modules. Once again, anytime you're doing anything with APIs, there's always modules for that. If you're doing anything that's like utility-based, there's always modules for that. So always just take a look for what there may be before you go ahead and kind of try to write your own. We talked a little bit about how, the package JSON, which to me is kind of like a requirement listing, how it works. And it's the idea of just, that whole listing of these modules that this project's going to need. And, if you go into that project and you use NPM, now it's very common when you first start working with Node, and I still do it, where it's like I'll be Node NPM and I'll be like trying to run something with NPM, and that's not its job. That's Node's job. But if you go in and you say, okay, I'm going to install what's in this folder or the dependencies, it will create basically a local kind of Node modules folder and dump everything in there. So it keeps that kind of nice environment that's not polluting everything everywhere. In that kind of scenario. You can also install modules if you want globally. You might constantly use something across the board and assume that other people are as well, whatever it may be. So you can also, install those things globally if you want, which is, the same in a lot of other languages. If you're working in Python, similar kind of idea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and what's really cool, that one of my favorite things about having all your Node modules installed to your local folder is that I can just copy that whole folder and all my dependencies will come with me. That's just one of the things that I love about this structure. So
I think we're going to leave you with this module with some resources that are listed on this slide. Once again, we've listed the GitHub repo, GitHub repo. I'm going to pronounce it like that from now on. And we've also just gone through and some resources on Node. We've gone through the basics, so you can take some of these for further reading. Definitely read up on things like asynchronous programming, read up a little bit on promises, get that kind of sense of what's going on and how those things work. In our next module, what we're going to do is we're going to cover just an intro to the Express framework, and just getting your very first Express app running, that kind of scenario, and kind of take you a little bit further down the road of Node. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll see you guys in 10 minutes. Welcome back. When it's a Web Wednesdays.
Web Wednesdays.
And we're doing Node.js. That does not roll off my tongue. I'm sorry. We're doing Node.js, and we're going to be just starting in on our second module, which is kind of explaining the Express framework and how that works with Node.
We're really happy that you guys are back, to be honest. Thank you so much. Hopefully Express is going to be one of those tools that you'll use frequently after you see how awesome it is.
Yeah. A couple things that we can do is quickly just answer a couple questions that came up in the chat room, and we'll just quickly try to roll those in. One thing to note is that we're using Visual Studio to kind of go through some of the Node projects. There's, and I think I'll bring up the link here. There is node.js tools for Visual Studio, and I have the link here that we can see on my screen, and it's basically you can download these, you can install them, and so if you go to create a new project or a new Node or Express project, it'll have those templates for you. Provide some of those tools. It will recognize those things happening in Visual Studio for you.
Yeah, and you'll see us using it towards the 6th module, where we'll start doing some remote debugging with Azure with the tools for Visual Studio.
Right.
So you'll be able to see it in action.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other questions that kind of came up, was let's see. A couple people mentioned just blocking I/O versus non-blocking I/O. If you have something that you're doing that's a kind of like a big operation, the best advice I think we can possibly give is just go asynchronous all the way.
Yep.
And once again, it's got to be one of those things where you got to consider, depending on what you're doing, if it's really data heavy.
Yeah. Let's say you're editing some video, and your service edits some video in the back end. What you'll want to do, ideally, is run it as async as possible. And one of the ways you could do that is by literally spinning up another process. There's the process module that will let you do that very simply, and you'll be able to assign a callback. So when that process is done, you'll actually get the result of it. So you don't have to run things on your server event loop at all.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that you could do for long-running operations that are really mandatory and blocking.
Right.
So
just once again, it's one of those things you got to consider architecturally and when you're building your application. We had another question just quickly. What is TypeScript? TypeScript is produced by Microsoft.
Right.
It extends the functionality of JavaScript. Unlike some other kind of, there's variations that people kind of slotted in with CoffeeScript and things like that. TypeScript kind of extends it. So plain JavaScript will work. TypeScript. And it gives you strict typing is one of the number one features with it. So you get that idea of, especially if you come from a language where it's a little more structured, you got strict typing, all that kind of good data stuff that you don't get right out of the box in JavaScript. TypeScript extends. So it's worth checking into if you come from, let's say, not a JavaScript background and you're coming from something where you're, like C# or that kind of thing, where you're used to that kind of, ability to type to variables and things like that.
Yeah, it's really powerful if you want to do some static typing. It's a superset on top of JavaScript, so all of your JavaScript code will work, but the additions that TypeScript offers only works if you're then using TypeScript to recompile it down into basic JavaScript. So it's very similar to the way CoffeeScript works, if you've used CoffeeScript before.
Right. The beauty of TypeScript is that your JavaScript will just work. You don't have to worry about anything else. So you can, write a line of JavaScript, or you can, write it in TypeScript and you're fine.
Yeah.
We got audio is fading in and out since the break. Thank you. We'll take a look into that. Awesome. Number one suggestion for audio problems: refresh the page always. So let's start getting into Express a little bit and talking about the Express framework and how it works with Node. And how we can use it, and show a simple example of maybe building a really, really basic REST API. One of the things you can start to do if you're not sure how you want to use Node is that Node is really great. I mean, all those server-side languages, but Node's great for really quickly getting up and running an API of some sort. Maybe you need to get data that's pulled in from somewhere. Maybe you need to create something that's like fake data because whoever is doing the services hasn't finished the services yet. Any of those kind of things, you can get up and running and build something like that in Node quite easily, and have something working and that you can test with, that you're not just pulling in a JSON file or writing a bunch of objects out that you think are going to emulate the data. So that's for me, that was one of the first uses of Node that I came across. I was like, I think I'm just going to build a basic API because I always need those. I always need to save data or get data or whatever it may be. So when we're going to talk about Express in this module, we're going to talk about, what is Express? Some people call it Express Web Framework, Express Framework. I hear it mostly as Express. We're going to talk about installing and using Express. We're going to demo, creating a very simple REST API and kind of show you where you could go with it a little bit. And we're going to talk about a couple other things in Express, whether it be templating, maybe some the idea of middleware you'll hear tossed around a lot.
Yep.
So we'll kind of just walk through those things for you and give you kind of the basics. And again, when we start building out our chat application, which is coming up, all of these things we're teaching you right now, we're going to be using. So we'll be using the Express framework. So this will give you a nice, good kind of starter point for that. So, what is Express? Often, if you're searching the web, you'll see the mean stack, for example, right? So you'll see, so that's Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node, for example. So you'll see something along those lines. You'll see Node always with Express. Sometimes it's Node, Express, Mongo, right? Angular seems to be something, a little bit client-side framework tossed in there. You tend to see them quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
And so what is Express? How would you describe Express if I said to you, okay, I know a little bit about Node. I know enough to write basically, I want to start serving up some web pages.
Yeah.
How do I handle things in terms of building out this website?
So Express is this web framework that lets you structure your web application to handle multiple different HTTP requests at a specific URL. So if you remember when we did our HTTP server, we had one callback that would handle all the requests that our HTTP servers got. But as you know, websites are not just one page for the most part. They might have different URLs. Express lets you structure your program so that you can handle multiple URLs and multiple HTTP requests, whether it's a get, post, put, patch, delete, and handle it in a very simple way and straightforward way. And you'll see that when we're going to use it to create a very simple REST API that will handle a get request for our front end, whatever front end we're building.
Right, and so Express is one of those things that's really handy if you're building out a whole website, but also if you're just building out an API, because sometimes all you need is that endpoint, and then you're okay, I need students, and I need to get students, I need to put students, I need to any of those CRUD operations that you might do, right?
Exactly.
So it's really easy to get up and running there.
Yeah, and there's very simple ways to use Express to return JSON properly with the right content type with a simple function call, so you don't have to set everything manually like we did in our HTTP demo.
Yeah, or going in through some other languages, for example, you're writing headers and you're writing all this other kind of stuff before you return stuff. Express, when you think about Express, it's important to note that it works with Node. It's for Node. And a lot of times when you come from a front-end background, at least I feel like this has been my experience, coming from a front-end, moving into Node, okay, there's JavaScript on the server, there's JavaScript on the front, okay, my folder structure might be some here, here's my, public. Often you'll see is, that's what's client-side, here's what's happening on the server. Express is used for Node on the server.
Yeah, it's
mostly to handle a lot of what we just mentioned about that structure of the HTTP calls.
Yeah, it's a module on your server backend, and it doesn't actually do anything on the front end. So it's strictly on the back end.
So a couple of reasons why you should use Express. If I said to you, okay, I've been looking at it, why do I need to learn yet another web framework? I feel like that's my life right now. Every time you look, there's some new framework, some new library. Why should I use why should I learn Express? Why should I spend the time?
Well, Express is fairly well established. And it's got a huge community behind it, lots of middleware for Express that you can use to extend Express, huge community around it. So if you're using Node and you need a framework as your default, Express I think I would recommend would be the best one. Now Express